This is a completely unrehearsed conversation, and it will be a combination of questions that I've dreamed of asking William Gass since I last saw him several years ago, and questions that I want to ask for people who may not yet know his work. I wanted to begin with that musical structure, since we heard a fugue, and you mentioned the Cartesian sonata form, and I had no idea of this, the Schoenberg system of notation.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about the music of your work?
Well, I find, since I don't have a structure generally that vaguely even resembles plot or a story or something, there's usually something there. Of course, you can't eliminate it altogether. But what I prefer to work with are themes and symbols and sort of moods and conditions. So I find frequently that a musical structure is much more amenable to the kind of thing I want to do. Of course, it has to be adapted. You can't really do it. And the Schoenberg thing is a far stretch. It's a metaphor. What I wanted to do was to, choosing Schoenberg means freeing the old notes from previous systems. And then the idea of having 12 chapters, about the same length, and in each chapter all 12 of my fundamental motifs that I had chosen. There are a lot of minor ones, but fundamental motifs would be sounded, but in different arrangements, so that a certain aspect or meaning of the text would emerge more at the beginning, and then sink down and be relatively innocuous or weak at another point. All this is of course superimposed upon a completely different kind of structure, the tunnel itself, and so on. But that's the way I had in mind.
Well, that explains a lot to me. You know, people who are listening carefully to that wedding list may find in the back of their minds that they can hum along with it, since it comes, in a sense, set in a minor and destructive key from Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales. You'll remember all of the hundreds of uncles and aunts and the toys that they bring and the general tone of jolliness. And in fact, when that section, I used to read it over and over again. This was when it came out first in a chapter called We Have Not Lived the Right Life.
That's right.
In the New American Review, way before, 20 years before the novel finally appeared. And I'd read it to people over and over again saying, you've got to hear this. This is astonishing. You know, that so much can be crammed into a space like this that keeps opening out and out and out. And then one day I heard it. I heard Dylan Thomas there. So what you're talking about is rescoring, yes?
That's right. And in the tunnel in particular, where I had a lot more freedom than in the novellas, I did sort of secret homages for certain writers. There's one little section that's a homage to Donald Barthelme, another, of various sorts, where certain ticks, certain little signatures of their style was used to kick off. My good friend Gaddis, while I was working on this, said, "Don't you dare use me." No, so I was happy.
Can you do Gaddis?
No. What I did to Gaddis once was read a section of J.R., because he does very similar things in J.R., which is a section that forms up as a kind of well, it's not a fugue, but it's patterned, repetitive, and it's sort of Stein filtered through the musical structure to Gaddis, and he never reads and never hears himself read aloud much, so he's always a surprise to hear it. But I wouldn't try, no.
I want to situate this to some extent. How to put it? When I first read William Gass, it was he was one of only 5 writers, modern writers, that I ever wanted to hear anything about. and I couldn't hear enough. Those were John Barth, who happened to be a teacher at the State University of New York at Buffalo, John Hawkes, Donald Barthelme, William Gass, and preceding them a bit, William Gaddis. This was a mood in American literature that was making the impossible possible. We were having in American voices really remarkable innovations in our literature. The novel, for the first time, was coming new, as you suggest, unhinged from its conventional notes, subjected to new structures and new ideas. But of that group, you've remained always more connected to a particular part of the country and to a particular reality that, although the words may try to fly off the page and into their own order, still pulling them back down is the terror of the Midwest.
Yes, I guess. Though I think Barth always ends up on board ship. But yes, that's true. When I was younger, I guess like everybody who wants to leave home, the quicker the better, I always tried to get out of the Midwest and disliked where I was living and all of that. But it's like a bad frog who tries to leap out of the pond. I always ended up back in the pond. Now I like it quite a lot. I realize it is the source. And it's a source in many ways, because not just of the people or the landscape, because that's various indeed, but the weather. I mean, the Midwest weather has always fascinated me. Calamity is what it is, you know. One calamity after another. Now I live, of course, right at the edge of calamity, the river, which they, say is tamed, and then it floods like mad, and it's so that there's something about I sit in St. Louis and I think, am I not glad I'm not in Kansas City? It's 10 degrees colder there. But that part is very much a part of my work, the weather.
Now, in the tunnel, the kind of rhetorical majesty that you hear in that wedding section is characteristic of the book. You can't believe it. I mean, because at the same time, the work really is about, as they say, the fascism of the heart, and about a certain level of monstrosity. Now, Cartesian Sonata, the new book, seems to be willfully written in a frailer, broke-down form. It will not erupt into those virtuoso cadenzas. In fact, the person who's listening carefully can recognize from previous books of Gass paragraphs that have been watered down, diluted, as if this is a world that's getting more and more ideolated and less even able to raise its shoulders to give a good aria. Why? What's the choice?
One reason is, of course, that since the novel, the first novel I did took about 10, 12 years, and the second one took nearly 30. Considering at my age, I'm 74, that I would embark on another novel, I mean, so there were certain practical reasons. But I've always loved the novella, and always felt that it suited my breath, so to speak. Even when I was composing longer works, or even working in an essay, I tended to have a series of breaths of about 30 pages, and there seemed to be a kind of form that went with this, and so a short story might be a breath, or an essay might be a breath, and a novella, almost you stop just before you start panting. And I think that it's also something that does restrict you. And I had been, in a sense, allowing myself in the tunnel every resource. The first novella I ever wrote, The Peterson Kid, was deliberately restrictive because I knew that my very nature, my fundamental nature, was unbridled, soggy romanticism. So I established rules, all kinds of rules that you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that, and picked somebody that would, and put it in his point of view, who wouldn't have the big vocabulary or anything. With the novellas, I didn't. I limited myself not in terms of vocabulary, but their conception. In other words, I tried to give a larger vocabulary picture of a conception of things which is squeezed. But nevertheless, the novellas then make you consider tighter connections, deliberately lower your language, and then I wanted to sort of rediscipline, I guess, rein myself in a little.
But there seems to be as well, for instance, in the tunnel, the narrator, the hero, could we call him? What do we call him?
The monster.
The monster is named William Kohler, and there was a chapter that was published as Cole whistles up a wind. By the end of that chapter, he's doing a tornado. You know, it's going across the page. It's eating itself. Here, there's a similar emptiness. It's described as the emptiness inside a tin mailbox. Emma, in the novella you heard, says that memory is the emptiness inside us. And it seems as if in this book, all of these characters deliberately are failures. She is a failure as a poet. The man in bed and board cooks books. He alters details so that people can lie on their taxes. And there's almost as if built in is the idea that something must now fail in these sentences. They're enfeebled.
Yes. Well, that's true from the whole setup of the book, which isn't recent in its conception, but very old in conception, and that was to take the Cartesian problem of the three substances, the uncreated substance, God, which has always existed, and then the created substances, mind and matter. And then I did one section that's God, but it wasn't going to be, wasn't God the great and glorious, and it wasn't God the dead and gone, but it was God the incompetent, and, the real God, in my opinion. So and I modeled him in a way after a combination of sentimental romance novels and Ernest Hemingway. Because when I was starting to write that, there was a famous picture of Ernest Hemingway in Key West, stripped to the waist with a rope around his waist at a big trestle table, and taken by a very famous photographer. And it was in Life magazine, I think. Now, anyone who's reading that now, they're going to not get that reference, but there's plenty of references to the Hemingway macho kind of writing, which I detest. So that I was picking out that kind of structure. So all the way through, when I wanted then to take mind and matter, who in this then conception are married, and they of course don't get along, and that was the problem of Descartes' metaphysics. How do you get mind and matter to interact? Because they have nothing to do with one another, really.
So it's a failure of God.
Yes, yes. And so, and I'm of course hedging my bets. And so then I decided to write 3 other novellas. Each would be parallel to that initial sonata. So this is a sonata played this way, and then, or this way, and then a sonata played that way, as each one of these others lines up behind one of the sections. So Emma enters a line of Elizabeth Bishop, lines up behind the section Mind, in the first piece, and a piece that's all about objects. Bed and breakfast lines up alongside matter, and then the last one is back to God again, only we don't have God, we have a tin horn Lucifer. I mean, he's no better at his job than God is. So that was the idea of the structure of it. And that meant, of course, that things had to be sort of broken down. But it's also true that I haven't written anything about anybody who hasn't been a colossal flop. I mean, it's, well, not even colossal, just a floppy flop, not even.
As opposed to the Hemingway you abhor, there is the Gertrude Stein you adore. And I wanted to ask you, it seems to me, now Gass has written the best essays on Gertrude Stein I've ever seen. I'm grateful that they are now in books. They used to be as introductions to things like the Geographical History of America, and they promptly went out of print, you know, and now they're in collections. But it seems to me that Gertrude Stein never stops writing, that now it's a story, now a play, now an enormous novel, now a short poem, now a Valentine. We have every kind of Stein, and we almost get the sense that she writes entirely by instinct. And the opposite pole of your structures are the instinctual uses of language. And I wonder if over the years you've gotten to the point of that kind of density and complexity by instinct, that it's just the way you've tuned the sentence.
It doesn't seem to have gotten much better. I mean, you're sitting in front of them, you hope that your standards are higher, so, but you know. What happens is the same that's always happened, that as you start working on something and you find that you're really writing something else, you thought you were going this way, and actually the text is going another way. And I'm always very slow for that reason, because I don't really know, in that sense, what I'm doing. The theorizing I do, which is fun, I like to do it, that is, I keep very firmly set away from the table when I'm doing fiction, except, of course, theory is fiction, too. But I think that the whole problem that one faces is constantly, in writing, constantly not getting anywhere, and constantly having to go back. Writing is difficult for me because it's constantly saying, boy, you're really bad. After all this time, you're still doing this, you know. And that goes on and on. One would like to think that you're beginning to include these, but Stein was, of course, important to me because she taught me, I think, or I tried to learn from her, what the crucial thing about prose, and that was the sentence. And she studied what a sentence was. And while she didn't do it in some philosophical treatise, she did it by demonstration, by working. She knew how the problem of relation between writing a sentence and reading a sentence. For example, she starts a piece with a sentence, and she knows the reader's going to say, what in the world does that mean? And read it again. Well, she anticipates the reader, so she repeats it. And then, of course, the reader says, what is she repeating these two for? So you now have 4 of them. Now she knows that at 4, you're not going to go back and read again. She's a very smart woman. So she does the phenomenology of reading brilliantly. But when I countered sentences written by her, which have followed me in my head ever since, because they're keys to the very nature of language, but also the nature of reality. A sentence that one of my favorites is, it looked like a garden, but he had hurt himself by accident. I mean, that is just a treasure.
I have one. Every time they shake the tablecloth near the window, a glass falls out. You know?
Yeah.
Now, I think that, or at least the description of the hapless writers who variously populate your work are people who have sat at that desk learning not only words but letters. And I think that there is somewhere in the Gass papers the teaching, the learning of vowels in the same way that you say that Stein learned sentences.
Well, yes, I'm interested in all kinds of little funny things about words and music. Also, though, the visual side as well. But, you know, I'm always amazed by a word like in the state I grew up in, Ohio. That's just a little word here, you know. And people recognize that because they say round at the end and high in the middle, that's Ohio, you know. And then the difference between pit and pot, you know. And all the dentals and what happens when you're reading properly, and even though you're reading in your head, you're reading way our cat does. It goes, meaning I'm going to eat that sparrow alive. You know? And you're doing that in your head while you're reading, even if you're reading silently. So that the reading is accompanied by a lot of activity, muscular activities you're making. So I always wanted the words to be in the mouth. Not just also in the eye, but in the mouth, to be chewed. And I think always the great writers, at least the ones I admire most, are people who put things in your mouth. Rilke is wonderful about that, and of course, you know, the juice. Just he does a sonnet to the orange, dance the orange. It's a great line, and he talks about that and all the South that bursts forth in the mouth. Of course, only in Rilke do women have this experience. I don't know why that is, but it's a thing that I've always sort of wanted to feed the reader the words somehow.
Now, I've always wondered, because years ago there was a Paris Review interview with William Gass, and instead of a page of manuscript, there was a page of almost Kabbalistic symbols. There was a star with letters at its various points. Mm-hmm. There were letters given numbers, and I've been curious about that aspect of your work, which seems to me to be about measure, about shape, about an inner apportioning of sound.
Yes, that's been an odd obsession. I think I understand it a little better now than I did when I was younger, because when I was younger I wasn't as interested, I thought, in that visual aspect. But words become, for me, very physical entities. And that is in fact the Cartesian problem again, because they are the material and the sound and the sight, and they're combined in some odd way. And they are carrying these concepts around. And the concepts never get themselves dirty. They always send these sounds and shapes out to do the work for them. And the sounds and shapes are the ones that are appearing in language, in sentences, all the time, all over the world, and in that way adding on new meanings, which the concepts then sort of shear off, you know, as if these poor words were sheep. And I've always been fascinated by that interconnection. It seems to me that there's an enormous tension in literature between the conceptual frame of neither space nor time, the very Cartesian notion of mind, which concepts have, and which you're fundamentally working with. I mean, literature's fundamentally organizing conceptual schemes. And then this rather impoverished compared to the painter, the musician, these little squiggles and these little sounds. And then to try to get those together so that it's not just the old memory thing, but to make them palpable. And again, in Rilkean terms, to turn the poem into a ding thing.
In Cartesian Sonata, there's a section about a clairvoyante to whom objects speak. This is her version of the relation of objects to the mind. But it's not just objects that speak, it's patches of light, it's gusts of wind. A room is a symphony for her. So when she's in a three-dimensional space, as I was reading, it was not just gas feeding the mouth words, it was asking the reader, me, to imagine what it would be like if everything were capable of sentience, of communication, if we were surrounded by endless sensorium. And that's, I think, what your prose wants to do.
Yeah, that's I'd like to think so. But it happens to us all the time. Things do speak. Of course, we create things that speak. In the old days when people smoked, and you could express things through smoking. I remember you'd be in a faculty meeting, and you'd have your styrofoam cup you're clutching, and then you'd be smoking and burning holes in the styrofoam cup. And no one yelped, even though they were meant to. And you would be doing this sort of thing, or you'd put the cigarette out with a squash. When you put the cigarette out with the squash is still speaking there. It's indicating so when people were to leave the room, if they were Sherlock Holmes, he could pick up, because he was great at this, right? Sherlock Holmes would pick up this cup and said, "This person didn't like Amendment 2." So and in the old primitive, so-called primitive times, the world was full of life. Everything had its own soul. There are marvelous passages about this in Spinoza, who believed, of course, that everything was always acting to preserve its equilibrium or existence. So if you had a limp, for instance, the limp would take on its own life, and it wants to live. I mean, you want to get rid of this lovely limp, which you've had for some time. And so it strives to stay in existence. Everything is constantly doing this. So everything is sort of imaginary, has a life of its own. And that's a very primitive notion, but it's a great way to see the world in a certain sense. And emotionally, we do it all the time. In fact, emotionally, it's very comforting as well as scary, because it's what we mean by being at home, when everything that speaks to us of something pleasant. And when the home no longer does, when the tablecloth that was thrown at you along with the glass is there reminding you of that. And I do have a couple passages. This is all sort of comes from Rilke, who was ahead of everybody about all of this, where the air is still bruised from blows that have been struck by warring couples and so on. That kind of thing. Well, we all sense that. Bachelard, of course, is the great describer of spaces in that sense. And that's the animistic, the thing that the scientific side properly goes as far away from as possible. But there's a certain part of us, I think, that still likes to feel we're living in a world that's alive and has to be respected and can be angry at us. And our car won't start because it doesn't like us for some reason.
I want to describe one of the oddest days of my life. And I suppose in a Gassian sense, I want to make you jealous and envious of me. One day in the mail, came an orange crate. Inside the orange crate was the copy of the manuscript of the tunnel. And it had, in addition to the color pages you see in the hardcover, it had all sorts of special stamps, doodads, things that in fact did not make it ultimately over the process of the exigencies of publishing, the confusions of book designers. The book was meant to, have a armband around it, like a Nazi armband. It was meant to be printed in a print that looked like barbed wire, a kind of Gothic print. The book we see in front of us is not the imagined book. I have a version of the imagined book in an orange crate in my closet. But I wanted to ask you, Valerie talks a good deal about the ideal book against which any actual book is merely a simulacrum or an approximation. Yeah. And it seems that only once in the original version of Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife, when it was published by a literary magazine, Tri-Quarterly, this book had 3-color pages and then slick paper. It seemed like it was the ideal book, that they had done the book you'd envisioned.
Well, so both of those, the tunnel as well as the earlier one, were created by me almost as private things, because I knew that what I was doing was no longer possible in print in the ordinary sense. One of the things in the tunnel which I particularly sort of liked was the fact that one of the pages, or a couple of pages, were to be printed on a grocery sack. No double bagging needed, that kind of thing. And this was to be the sack in which the lovers had been. This was to be the sack of oranges that they carried around when they were mooning at one another in a walk around the lake. This was to be the sack she gives him eventually when she gets rid of him, and so on. So it was going to be a piece of this sack. There. Now the publishers tried their best to imitate this, but ideally, of course, I'd have a paper sack taken from a local grocery store with no double bagging needed, and so forth. And I wanted that particular concreteness again, but the ideal book really is a combination of kind of Valerian Platonism and a Beckett a mudslide. In how it is, the characters crawling around in the mud. And the ideal book, it seems to me, would be discovering the Platonic forms in the mud. They're both all there at once.
That's magnificent.
No, it's just muddy.
Is there a possibility of such a book? For instance, this problem still goes on. In one of these novellas was printed in a literary magazine named Conjunctions, and it had some extraordinary photographs with it. Photographs that I've learned didn't reproduce well, and they are not in the book.
Yeah.
This visual, musical whole that you make, is there any hope for a reader encountering that? Can the ideal book be made?
Well, I don't think so. Ideals are never realized, only tarnished, I think the photographer who did the work, who's, I think, a wonderful photographer whose work I admire immensely, and he happens to live across the street. And we're doing a number of minor collaborations. I have finished a novella for the next collection called In Camera. And what we are hoping to do, it's scheduled for publication in Conjunctions. What we're planning to do is run a photo strip right through the middle of the text, all the way through the piece. He does marvelous things that are perfect, I think, for the kind of text I'm writing or have written. but I'm hesitant about doing more of this because the paper that we can afford to use is simply too porous, and it doesn't take the image well enough. And so I hate to ask him to, even though the images have some great power, some of them, anyhow, it's like, you know, somebody saying, I want you to write for this book, and maybe most people will see several letters of the text you wrote. I mean, you know, he's a very fine artist, and to have his work not presented as perfectly as possible is hard for me to ask him to do that, although I might anyway. But that's an idea that we have in mind. I also am hoping to find a publisher for his marvelous sky-earth photographs, some of which he's taken here outside of Santa Fe, which are just extraordinary bands of land with light on it, meeting the dark level of low rises and then the sky, slightly like the cover picture which he did, which are in a sense photographic Rothkos. I mean, they're just, I think, stunning. I'd love to write an essay about those photographs and then find a way of getting them really produced properly. He's also a great architectural photographer. He's, I think, one of the better ones in the country myself. The reason he isn't well known is, where does he live? I mean,
My final question is a nearly impossible one to answer, but it's one I've always wanted to ask, and I'm astonished that to my mind it hasn't been asked you before. I wanted to ask about the relationship between the sophistication of the aesthetics of the book and the monstrosity and terror and horror and failure that they're about. It's almost another version of the mind-object problem.
Yes, that's another parallel, because one of the problems that has bothered, I think, philosophers for a long time, especially rationalists, is that sophistication doesn't redeem. I've heard many a humanist say, well, the humanities makes people better. It makes them craftier, maybe. You know, that was one of the reasons why I was interested in the problem of Hitler's Germany. It just raised to a higher level the problem that there wasn't any redeeming profession or anything that you could say, well, because he was a druggist, he was okay. People were, of course, resistant to the fascism of Germany, but it wasn't. You couldn't find them anywhere, and then there were people who weren't resistant. You find them anywhere. So there were, and we know, of course, that there are many, many very great artists who are awful people, not just crude, bumbling, stupid, but really nasty, people. And the connection between that has always fascinated me, because these great creations of the human spirit, some of the highest forms of things we've ever achieved, they sort of rise up as our great things. And yet the people who made them are in hell and deserve to be there. I mean, so that's the thing that in the 10th elegy, Rilke says, desperately, Chartres was great, wasn't it? Didn't we do something good? In this hope that but the problem which all this book, Cartesian Sonata, is about, really, is salvation or redemption, because everybody is trying to get saved one way or another. So you have this inept deity who's ruining everything, and then you have all these characters who are in bad places, and the the cookbook man, he finds his salvation, he thinks, through kitsch. I mean, he goes to this bed and breakfast and falls in love with all the objects he finds there. And
stuffed birds.
Yeah, everything in the world, okay, that's one way. This, Emma, that's through matter. But it's matter that's been molded by people. And even if it's terrible, sentimental stuff, it's been put into those things with the greatest concern and often genuineness. Handmade, as Gertrude says, went into a house filled with dirty things made by hand. That kind of situation. Emma wants to, since she represents the spirit, she wants to get salvation through poetry. But poetry doesn't save. And then, of course, finally, we have the man who wants to get salvation by creating a new religion, in which he will become a famous deity eventually, worshipped. And it's his idea of the most secret revenge, found a new religion.
Now, this question has a subsection, and I beg your indulgence because it's one I need to have answered. Accompanying this dichotomy between the beautiful and the horrifying, the horrific history, there's been a need in your work to identify yourself with the monsters that narrate them. Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife has Willie there. The historian in The Tunnel is named William Frederick Kohler. Mm-hmm. And again, these it's as if there are counterfeit selves. Mm-hmm. Now, I know you as a compassionate and insightful and perceptive man, but literary critics who don't know how to read have assumed that the novel The Tunnel is about William Gass, and it's almost hard to imagine such an identification being made, and yet you have provoked it.
Yeah.
I wonder why.
Well, partly just out of meanness to show that they don't know how to read. But partly because we're, in a certain sense, everyman. I mean, to talk about Kohler and create this character without and saying something which has rarely been brought up, probably because no one can connect me with Lewis in any way, but it can't happen here book. And what I'm saying is, yes, it can, and it is happening. And I'm terrified of the fascism that lies just below the surface, in fact, not very far below now. And when I was growing up, there was Father Coughlin, and there were Nazi meetings, and the Ku Klux Klan was all over Indiana, and so on. So it was something that I grew up with, seeing that kind of thing. To say, well, that's those people, is to cop out. I mean, it's us, and so I couldn't. One of the reasons for making those resemblances is that you are in this. The author's just is in the same suit everybody else is in, and in fact, since you are an author and an artist, you are still not redeemed. It doesn't do anything in that sense. No one can say, Wagner, a wonderful man. Celine, my darling, So, but there it is. I mean, that's philosophers are notoriously mean-spirited, narrow-minded, they go around Schopenhauering all day. So you have, and yet out of it comes these wonderful things. And I think that the answer, in a certain sense, is is, again, to go back to Rilke, as I do so often, and too many times, I suppose, with that great poem. He says, what do, poet? Well, how are you going to get by another day? I praise. So you sit down and praise, and you praise even the most awful things by trying to render them as eloquently, clearly, as perceptively as you're capable of doing. And Rilke says, why do things exist in this world? They exist to become invisible. That is to say, be seen by people and change from matter into mind. By being perceived properly. And in that sense, the whole world, which is constantly flowing, has to be perceived and saved and redeemed, even if it's awful. And in fact, especially because that's what we want to forget, rather than the other. And so the poem goes on, because I praise. And praise is the thing, he says in the sonnets. Well, I think that's true in a way. Celebration. When I'm reading a good book, a Beckett book, say, which is grim, but I don't come away thinking, oh, what an awful world. I think, my God, it's amazing this thing exists. It's about how awful the world is, but it isn't awful. It transforms it, and that's what I think we're supposed to do.
Thank you very much.